ClimEQ is a project by the Stockholm Environment Institute, the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, Linköping University and Utrecht University. The project seeks to inform the coherent implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are supposed to be achieved by 2030 in all countries.
The ClimEQ project aims to advance policy coherence research by focusing on the causes of policy incoherence and how it affects achievements of global climate and development goals, especially ambitious climate action and reducing inequality. So the project asks two broad questions. And the first question is, why do we often see incoherences in the implementation of the climate and sustainable development goals? And what are their causes? And the second broad question is, how does policy incoherence affect the achievement of multiple sustainable development goals, and particularly reducing inequality? In the second question, we are going from causes to consequences of policy coherence and explore outcomes from it, particularly with regards to how goals are achieved, whether they lead to more or less equal outcomes.
But what do we mean by inequality? There are many different dimensions to inequality. Think about economic inequality or spatial inequality, gender inequality, or intergenerational inequality. These many different dimensions can be felt all at the same time by an individual or a group, where disadvantage and deprivation intersect to create a very specific and unique experience of inequality. This is perhaps why some view inequality not just as an outcome, but as a multidimensional process. In this project, we are also looking to understand whether inequality in policy-making decision processes can lead to policy incoherence.
For instance, exit from coal contributes towards SDG 13 on climate action, but it may counteract SDG 8 on decent jobs and SDG 10 on reducing inequality.
The general assumption is that policy coherence is essential for leaving no one behind and for addressing inequalities. Through a literature review that we conducted on the links between policy coherence and inequality, we found that indeed policy incoherence can lead to inequalities. Yet, policy coherence, if only addressing one dimension of inequality, could actually increase other dimensions of inequality if these are not taken into account, or if there are strong conflicting interests and levels of power between involved stakeholders.
The project works in 6 countries: Germany, Kenya, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, South Africa and Sweden. In each country, local partners play an important role in conducting the project.
As a consortium, we have conducted over 200 semi-structured interviews with a variety of stakeholders, including policymakers, civil society, NGOs, and even activists, to understand the political drivers of policy incoherence and its effects on inequality. Within each country, we have focused on specific issue areas. For example, in Germany, we have looked at the energy transition or the Energiewende. In South Africa, we have looked at integrated resource management through the lens of the water, energy, food nexus. And in the Philippines, we have looked at green jobs in the context of agriculture and industrialization.
To better understand the connections between climate action and sustainable development, we analyzed climate activities in countries' nationally determined contributions, the so-called NDCs, and how these are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. In that regard, we classified all climate activities depending on the SDG target, on specific climate actions related to those SDGs, and also with regard to cross-cutting themes that are relevant to multiple SDGs. We use this to also make a comparison between the first NDCs and the updated NDCs.
While considerable research on policy coherence and integration exists, the questions on the causes and the consequences of policy coherence have not been addressed much in the literature.
We have found that inequality is both a driver and a consequence of policy incoherence between sustainable development and climate targets. Where trade-offs that create disadvantage exist, these are in part due to inequalities in decision-making processes or what we might equate to political inequality. This is problematic for several reasons, not least because it can undermine democratic systems. As such, these inequalities in process need to be addressed adequately.
The lack of effective progress raises questions not only about political will and ambition, but also how to enable fair and effective implementation going forward. Meanwhile, clear and increasing evidence shows that successful climate action needs to address all dimensions of sustainable development and vice versa.
We have learned that striving for perfect policy coherence is unrealistic simply because it's unattainable. Where trade-offs exist between climate and sustainable development policies, these need to ensure that they do not aggravate or deepen existing inequalities. This is the real challenge that policy coherence needs to overcome if it is to be a successful policy tool.
Given how tightly climate change and sustainable development action are interlinked, policy coherence to boost synergies between the two and to address trade-offs will be essential, in particular with a view to just transition. Measures related to just transition and also inclusive participation have been taken up more and more in the updated nationally determined contributions. However, more needs to be done and more countries need to consider such impacts.
We have identified many institutional, interest-based and ideological drivers of policy incoherence. These need to be taken seriously by all stakeholders, especially policymakers, if countries are to achieve the aims of both the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development.
Addressing climate change is essential to reduce inequalities, as vulnerable communities will suffer most from its impacts. At the same time, the climate action that we need to take will lead to deep transformations of our societies and also of our economic systems with both positive and negative effects. This requires adequate policy making to ensure that inequalities across various dimensions are not increased, but rather reduced.
Policy coherence is not an end in itself, and there will be never perfect policy coherence. But increasing policy coherence is still very important for sustainable development. But this is not a technocratic, but a political process.